to take that action.
That was Gordon Brown, the former Labour Prime Minister. With me in the studio, Emily Bellett, a former analyst for Lehman Brothers, we've seen already, who's gone on to launch a finance company, Vestpod, and Stephen Loosley, who's a risk expert from the financial consultancy Catalyst, who was directly involved in containing the scale of the crash back in 2008. Good to have you both in the studio, and both of you offering very different perspectives. Very quickly, Emily, what are you doing now?
So I'm the founder of Vestpod, and it's a fintech startup helping women to manage their personal finances.
Okay, so very much focused on helping women to have a perspective on finance, which you thought was a bit of a gap in the market, yes?
Exactly. I thought there was a big gap between what was happening in the banks and what was happening outside of the banks.
Interesting. And today's task for you, Stephen, is what?
Today's task for me. So I'm a partner in a financial markets consultancy called Catalyst, and we advise banks and pieces of financial market infrastructure how to comply with regulation.
Okay, and how much of that is drawn on your experience of 10 years ago?
A significant amount, actually. After Lehman's went bust and the G20 got together in Pittsburgh in 2009 and said, you know, we need to regulate banking better, we need to regulate market infrastructure better, and my experience then became, you know, pretty useful afterwards.
Right, so this is what I think viewers would be very interested in, where you were 10 years ago and what you were doing. So just give us a sense of what point you were at in your career for a start, Emily, first of all, and you know how you experienced what happened at that point.
Yeah, so I just moved actually from Paris to London. I finished my studies in France and I moved for a job at Lehman, and at the time I got offered a summer internship, and that was quite prestigious to work for a big investment bank. So I finished my studies, packed my bag and moved to London to work for Lehman as a full-time analyst. And I was working in the private equity team, so that means I was looking at businesses, analyzing the businesses and deciding should we invest, should we not invest in this type of companies.
At what point did you become acutely aware that things were not good?
I think, you know, as everyone were reading the news, it's not that as a junior employee you had more information than other people, and then of course the last weekend when Lehman wasn't rescued, that's when we realized, you know, this is actually happening.
At that point, Stephen, I think it's fair to say that you were in the engine room, I think something called the London Clearing House, is that right?
That's right.
Just tell us what the function of that was, because it was absolutely crucial and highly secure as a mechanism. What was your function there? What were you trying to do?
So I was one of the risk managers that looked after a portfolio of some of the riskier trades that Lehman left behind when they went bust. And the clearinghouse is really there as a circuit breaker in the financial system to make sure that when one bank goes bang, or as an electric appliance might go bang, that shock isn't transmitted to every other electric appliance so that they also go bang. So we're there to insulate the circuit.
That sounds tense and it sounds stressful. What was the worst moment?
I think the worst moment was when I realised that this event that is my job, that I've been preparing for ages, that I don't actually ever want to happen, has actually happened.
Yeah.
You know, the penny drops.
Yeah. And the penny dropped to what effect? So what were you confronted with?
We were confronted with 66,000 of Lehman's more complex trades across 5 currencies, out to a duration of about 30 years, some of these trades.
Wow.
$9 trillion worth. And when the markets opened on the Monday morning and interest rates started to move, we were winning or losing $6 to $7 million for every 100th of 1% that interest rates moved.
Well, so those figures are just impossible to take on, to be honest, for anyone who's not involved in the business like that. If you hadn't got it right, what would have happened?
It's that contagion point. It's the shock spreading to other players within the system. If we at the clearinghouse and the whole team hadn't been able to insulate that shock, then there was the possibility that the other banks would fall like dominoes.
Mm. To what extent were you aware, Emily, of the risk of that contagion when you realised that Lehman was in such big trouble, but you were part of even a much, much bigger thing? What was the moment of that realisation?
I think you first realize by the announcement Lehman is going bankrupt, then you realize because the employees and people around you are, you know, packing their stuff. Yeah. But you realize the bigger impact quite quickly, and you see, of course, you see the news and you have the press, you know, outside of the building, and you realize the impact for people outside the bank actually.
Do you think the financial industry is in a better place today?
I think it's a bit better, but I don't think it's great, and I think there's still a lot of things to improve, and I think that's why I came back building a company that has a more like social value, trying to empower people everywhere to better manage their money, their own money.
Okay, so just to be a bit more specific, when you say that it's improved a little, Where has it improved, and what are the biggest areas in which it hasn't improved?
I think for me it hasn't improved for the end customer, and that's where I'm really looking at. For me it's really financial education. I look at financial literacy and I see it's very low everywhere in Europe. It's the same in the States actually, and I don't see financial education being on the agenda 10 years later.
It's interesting. So the financial education point is one. There was of course a very strong perception at the time, and it still exists today, that lots of this was down to irresponsible lending, it was down to people being reckless or even greedy, and that those lessons haven't been learned. Now, given your place in the firmament, what's your take on that?
So I think that there are three things I'd say about the consequences. Not least that there was a lot of reckless behaviour then, and we've spent 10 years paying for that as an economy and as a society. But banks are better capitalised than they ever were before, so they're holding more reserves against future shocks. They're regulated more transparently, so we should see more of that excessive risk-taking should it ever happen again. And there are more circuit breakers in that financial system than there have ever been before.
So might you slightly disagree with Emily that more has improved in the meantime, not less?
I think a lot has improved, but I think Emily's right that the impact of that hasn't yet fed down necessarily to the end users of financial products, and that society at large is still paying for 10 years worth of post-crisis behaviour.
When Gordon Brown says that the world could well be sleepwalking towards another kind of crisis, maybe provoked by slightly different things, is he overstating it, or do you think the potential is there?
I think the potential is there, and I think we could see another financial crisis.
Is that your view as well?
Absolutely. I mean, economies are cyclical, financial crises are cyclical. You can do your very best to make sure the same problems don't happen again, but nobody has a crystal ball for the future.
Very quick question to both of you just to end on, because we're 10 years on. If somebody says to you, I'm sure you do, and friends and colleagues, they refer back to the events of 10 years ago, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of that time?
It was a shock.
A shock personally and in terms of where you were working?
Personally, in terms, I mean, that was my first job, so for me, I think it was the hardest experience.
What comes to your mind straight away?
Pressure.
And the way that you dealt with it, or that others dealt with it, or the way that government dealt with it?
I think the way that the default resolution team, the team handling Lehman's going bust at the clearinghouse dealt with it, we had to decamp to this nasty old former Lloyds Bank gold vault called Sampson House on the South Bank that was, it looks like a bunker, it's brutalist architecture.
Sounds very 007, doesn't it?
It is very much so.
Yeah.
And it was pretty grim times.
Well, you clearly got through it, and I've lived to tell the tale, and it's good to have your lessons today, 10 years on as well. So, Emily and Stephen, great pleasure to talk to you both. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.